It was a quiet winter morning in West Valley City, Utah. 28-year-old Susan Powell, a devoted wife and mother of two, went about her Sunday routine: church, family time, small talk with a friend who stopped by. Nothing seemed out of place. But by the next day, everything had changed. Susan never arrived at work. Her phone went unanswered. Her purse and keys were still at home. When police questioned her husband, Josh Powell, he gave a baffling story. He'd taken their two young sons on a midnight camping trip in sub-zero weather, leaving Susan behind. What kind of father does that? And what really happened after they drove off into that frozen Utah night? If you believe Susan deserves justice, like this video, share her story, and subscribe so her voice is never forgotten, and hit the notification bell. Susan Marie Cox Powell was born in 1981, the middle daughter of Chuck and Judy Cox. She grew up in a loving Latter-day Saints family in Puyallup, Washington, friendly, reliable, known for her easy smile and steady faith. In 2001, she married Joshua Powell after meeting him at a church dinner. At first, their marriage looked happy. But by 2009, friends say Susan confided that Josh had grown controlling, keeping strict control over finances, tracking her spending, and arguing over church commitments. She was the family's steady hand, working at Wells Fargo Investments, while Josh jumped from one job to another. On Sunday, December 6, 2009, Susan got up early, bundled her sons Charlie, age 7, and Braden, age 5, into the car, and drove to their morning church service. Witnesses remembered the family sitting together near the back pew. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear. Later that afternoon, a friend named Giovanna Owings stopped by the Powell house to knit and chat. Susan complained mildly about headaches but was cheerful. Giovanna later told police she saw Josh cooking pancakes while Susan rested on the couch, the last verified sighting of Susan alive. That night, snow began to fall. The temperature dropped below freezing. By dawn on Monday, Utah was blanketed in white. Susan's co-workers expected her at the office, but she never arrived. Calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. Her daycare provider also called repeatedly. Susan never missed drop-off. By 9 a.m., the alarm spread through her friends and church community. Police were dispatched to perform a welfare check at the Powell home on Sarah Circle. When they arrived, no one answered the door. Officers saw no signs of forced entry, but friends who came to help noticed something strange through a window. Two box fans aimed at a wet spot on the carpet. They broke a small pane to enter. Inside, the scene was chilling in its normality. Susan's purse sat neatly on the kitchen counter beside her wallet and ID. Her cell phone was still on the charger. Coats hung by the door. Her shoes were lined up by the entryway. It didn't look like someone preparing to leave. The fans hummed quietly over a freshly cleaned patch of carpet, and Susan was gone. Hours later, around 5 p.m., Josh finally returned home with the two boys. When questioned, he appeared calm, almost detached. He told police he had taken Charlie and Braden camping overnight at Simpson Springs, a barren desert site nearly 25 miles southwest of Tooele. The family had supposedly left after midnight, returning that afternoon. Susan, he said, had been asleep when they left. Detectives were stunned. Who takes toddlers into a snowstorm at 2 a.m.? The roads were icy, the desert freezing, and there was no record of Josh bringing sleeping bags or food. Officers immediately checked Simpson Springs. They found no tire tracks, no campfire, no campsite, nothing to suggest he had ever been there. The story made no sense. Meanwhile, Susan's parents were frantic. They flew in from Washington the next day, pleading for answers. Chuck Cox told reporters his daughter would never abandon her children. She would have walked through fire to be with those boys. Friends echoed the same. Susan had recently confided fears that Josh might hurt her if she ever tried to leave. Those fears weren't baseless. Investigators learned that Susan had secretly written a will and stored it at work, along with digital copies of her belongings. One haunting note read, "If I die, it may not be an accident." In video footage later recovered from a friend's camera, Susan recorded herself walking through the house, documenting her furniture and jewelry while saying she didn't trust her husband. When questioned further, Josh's behavior grew evasive. He avoided direct answers, hired an attorney, and refused a polygraph test. He claimed to be exhausted and told detectives he didn't know why everyone was making such a big deal. That phrase would stay with investigators. It sounded rehearsed, defensive, and deeply unsettling. By the end of that week, the search for Susan stretched across the Utah desert. Helicopters swept over the Ochre Mountains. Volunteers combed frozen fields and snowpack trails. Police seized computers, phones, and hard drives from the Powell home, uncovering evidence of marital strain and a troubling financial picture. Maxed out credit cards, overdrawn accounts, and insurance paperwork with Susan's name on it. Even with mounting suspicion, Josh was never arrested. Without a body or eyewitness, prosecutors lacked enough to charge him. West Valley City Police named him a person of interest, but his cooperation stopped completely. To the outside world, the Powell's modest home on Sarah Circle became a symbol of hidden tragedy, a normal-looking house holding unbearable secrets. Inside its quiet rooms, police found traces of Susan's blood near the couch and on a tile floor. They also discovered her life insurance policy and journals where she had written about her hope to protect her children from conflict. It was evidence, but not enough to close the case. The first days after Susan vanished were a blur of press conferences, prayer vigils, and public speculation. Candlelight flickered outside the family home as neighbors whispered theories about what had happened that night. Through it all, Josh appeared calm, sometimes even irritated by the attention. When reporters asked him if he had harmed Susan, he simply said, "No comment." Behind the scenes, investigators noticed inconsistencies in Josh's timeline. GPS records didn't match his story. Cell tower pings placed him far from Simpson Springs during key hours. Still, with no body and no confession, the case stalled. Days became weeks. Hope faded into the kind of silence that only unsolved crimes carry. But in that silence, one truth began to emerge. Susan Powell had been afraid long before she disappeared. Her friends said she had tried to save her marriage, tried to hold her family together. She loved her boys more than anything. And yet, in the middle of a Utah winter, she vanished into thin air while the man who was supposed to protect her told a story no one could believe. What kind of father takes toddlers into freezing weather at midnight? And why didn't he answer his phone? If you believe Susan deserves justice, share her story, like this video, and subscribe to make sure her name is never forgotten. It started as a routine welfare check, but the moment officers stepped inside the Powell family home, they knew something was off. Susan's purse sat undisturbed by the couch. Inside were her keys, ID, and wallet. Her cell phone lay nearby. These were things no woman would leave behind voluntarily, especially not a mother heading out for the day. The house itself was eerily quiet. The air was still. No sounds of children playing, no signs of morning activity. What they found instead was unsettling. A box fan was running on full blast in the living room, pointed at a wet spot on the carpeted couch. The officers asked Josh about the wet spot. He brushed it off, saying one of the boys had spilled juice. But something about the setup didn't sit right. Who uses an industrial strength fan on a juice spill? Why wasn't Susan concerned about it? If she was just out for a bit. More troubling discoveries followed. Police noticed that Susan's makeup and hair products were untouched. Her winter coat and shoes were still inside. There was no evidence that she'd left the home on her own. It was as if she had simply vanished in the middle of her life. In the days that followed, the Powell residence was searched more thoroughly. Investigators found traces of Susan's blood on the tile floor near the living room couch. Not enough to confirm a violent altercation, but enough to raise alarm. A forensic luminol test revealed additional blood evidence that had been cleaned. DNA confirmed it was Susan's. Hidden among her personal belongings, detectives found something chilling. A handwritten letter, dated in 2008, over a year before her disappearance. It read like a warning from beyond the grave. Susan wrote, "If I die, it may not be an accident. Take care of my boys." She expressed fear for her life and deep concern about her husband's temper and erratic behavior. The note was not dramatic. It was measured, sorrowful, and disturbingly clear. It was the kind of letter a woman writes when she feels cornered but unheard. Friends and family began coming forward with stories that painted a darker picture of the Powell marriage. Susan had confided in multiple people about her fears. She'd told co-workers that she was unhappy, that Josh was controlling, that he restricted her access to money and transportation. One friend recalled how Josh refused to buy Susan her own cell phone until she started working outside the home, and even then, he monitored it. Others said Josh often degraded Susan in public, criticizing her looks, her parenting, her beliefs. Susan's father, Chuck Cox, remembered how tense things had become in their home. He said Susan was the one holding the family together. A bright, loving woman who doted on her boys and worked hard to make ends meet. She had taken on a job with Wells Fargo to support the family financially while Josh jumped from one failed business idea to the next. There were also strange behaviors that, in hindsight, felt more ominous. Like the time Susan filmed a video walkthrough of her home, documenting possessions, furniture, and valuables, just in case something happened to her. In the video, she sounds calm, but you can hear a quiet urgency in her voice. She was trying to leave a record. She was trying to protect her children from the chaos she feared was coming. Then, within days of her disappearance, Josh did something no innocent husband would do. He hired a defense attorney. He refused to sit down for a formal interview with police. He declined to take a polygraph. He offered no help organizing a search party or putting up flyers. And when the media asked questions, he gave vague answers, often redirecting attention to irrelevant topics. As investigators pressed harder, Josh became more defensive. He stopped cooperating altogether. He denied them further access to the home. The fan was gone by then. The carpet had been cleaned again. He would not explain the origin of Susan's blood. The house was starting to feel like a crime scene no one could officially call a crime scene because without a body, the case was in limbo. By this point, the local community was becoming emotionally invested in the mystery. Vigils were held for Susan. Volunteers organized search efforts. Her co-workers, church members, and neighbors joined the effort to find any trace of her. But Josh remained distant from it all. He rarely showed emotion. His story never changed, not even as new evidence surfaced. What began as concern turned into deep suspicion. Then Josh made another move that baffled everyone. He packed up the boys and moved back to Washington State to live with his father, Steve Powell, a man who would soon bring even more disturbing revelations to light. When asked why he would leave while his wife was still missing, Josh claimed he needed to start over and be closer to family. But police knew better. Josh was putting distance between himself and the investigation. As weeks turned into months, detectives continued to build their case. Though they didn't have Susan's body, they had motive. They had circumstantial evidence. They had testimony from friends, relatives, and co-workers. They had the letter. They had the blood. And they had the silence, the loudest indicator of guilt, from a husband who should have been fighting like hell to find the woman he claimed to love. But in a legal system that hinges on beyond a reasonable doubt, investigators couldn't make a move yet. They needed more. They needed Susan. And Susan, the bright, brave, and burdened woman whose voice had been silenced, seemed to be slipping further from their reach. It was a story that stunned the detectives the moment they heard it. According to Josh Powell, he had taken his two young sons, Charlie, age 7, and Braden, age 5, on a spontaneous camping trip. The catch? He claimed they left around midnight on December 7, 2009, in the middle of a Utah snowstorm. Susan, he said, had decided to stay home and sleep. The alleged destination was Simpson Springs, a remote desert location on the Pony Express Trail, nearly 100 miles away. Temperatures that night dropped well below freezing. There were no tents, no firewood, barely any food. Just Josh, his two toddlers, and a bizarre idea of winter recreation. The timing, the conditions, and the lack of preparation raised eyebrows immediately. Detectives couldn't make sense of it. Who takes two small children out into a snow-covered desert after midnight on a Sunday night? And why hadn't he called anyone when he realized Susan was missing? When police questioned Josh the next day, he seemed strangely detached. He didn't appear worried. He didn't ask for updates. He told the same camping story but offered few details. He claimed he left between 12 and 12:30 a.m., drove out to Simpson Springs, spent the night in the van, and returned home the next afternoon. According to him, he had no idea Susan was missing until police contacted him. But his phone records painted a different picture. Authorities noted that Josh had turned his phone off during critical hours, something they believed was an intentional move to avoid GPS tracking. When he turned it back on, it pinged off towers far from Simpson Springs. The area Josh described was vast and rugged. Search teams were deployed to comb the region, looking for any sign that he and the boys had actually been there. What they found was damning in its absence. There were no tire tracks consistent with Josh's van, no footprints, no discarded food wrappers, no fire pits. In short, no evidence that anyone had camped there at all. Investigators quickly grew suspicious. Josh's story didn't hold up, but without a body or a confession, they couldn't charge him with a crime. Instead, they kept digging, both figuratively and literally. Back at the Powell home, they found other red flags. A cold box fan had been set up to blow air on a wet patch of carpet. There were no clear answers about what had been cleaned up. Investigators collected samples and would later confirm they found traces of Susan's blood. Combined with the odd late-night camping trip, the signs pointed to something far more sinister than a family outing gone wrong. Josh's behavior became increasingly erratic. He declined to take a polygraph test. He refused to let police speak to his sons without supervision. He offered vague, sometimes conflicting details about the timeline of events. At one point, he rented a car and drove over 800 miles before returning it. His whereabouts during that time were never fully accounted for. Public opinion began to turn against him. Susan's family, heartbroken and desperate, pleaded with him to cooperate. Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, were especially vocal. They believed Josh knew exactly what had happened, and that he was hiding something horrific. Josh, however, went on the defensive. He stopped cooperating with police entirely and quickly hired an attorney. Not long after, he packed up the boys and moved out of Utah, relocating to Puyallup, Washington, to live with his father, Susan Powell. The move baffled investigators. Why take the boys out of their home state while their mother was still missing? And why live with a father who had a troubling past of his own? Meanwhile, police were still trying to piece together the timeline. They interviewed neighbors, friends, church members. Many recalled troubling moments. Susan expressing fear, talking about financial strain, and worrying about her safety. One friend remembered Susan saying, "If something happens to me, look at Josh." Every detail further unraveled Josh's story. Investigators began to suspect the camping trip wasn't an alibi, it was a smokescreen. A way to explain his absence and distract from what may have happened inside the Powell home. Over the next few months, the case became national news. The image of Susan, a smiling, dark-haired woman with her whole life ahead of her, was broadcast across TV screens and shared online. Vigils were held. Community members tied blue ribbons around trees in her honor. Yet Josh remained silent. No public appeals. No emotional pleas. Just cold, careful deflection. To many, it became painfully clear. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was the beginning of a much darker mystery. Do you think Josh Powell's camping story was a desperate cover-up? Or something far more calculated? If the story matters to you, help us keep Susan's name alive. Like this video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that deserve to be told. It wasn't just Josh. That realization hit like a thunderclap. As the weeks stretched into months after Susan Powell vanished, investigators pulled at every thread they could find. And one of those threads, one that initially seemed unrelated, led them straight to a man who had been quietly living in the background. Susan Powell, Josh's father. At first glance, Stephen was just another grieving family member. He made public appearances, gave interviews, and insisted that Susan had simply run off. But beneath that carefully constructed surface, something darker was festering. And soon, the world would come to see that the Powell family wasn't just troubled. It was terrifying. In August 2011, nearly 2 years after Susan disappeared, detectives executed a search warrant at Susan Powell's home in South Hill, Washington, where Josh had been living with his two sons, Charlie and Braden. What they found there would shift the entire focus of the investigation. Inside the house, investigators uncovered what they would later describe as a trove of deviant material. It started with journals, hundreds of pages of Stephen's handwritten entries, meticulously chronicling his feelings for Susan. These weren't the reflections of a concerned father-in-law. They were the writings of a man obsessed. Stephen had written about Susan's beauty, about her body, about intimate moments he fantasized about, and even about the times he believed she had flirted with him. He wrote about smelling her underwear, watching her through bathroom doors, and worse, he believed they had a mutual, unspoken connection. He wrote, "I have never felt this way about anyone, including my wife." But it didn't stop at journals. In a locked cabinet, detectives found hundreds of secretly recorded videos and photographs. Some were taken from windows. Others appeared to have been filmed with hidden cameras placed in Susan's bedroom and bathroom during family visits. In one clip, Susan is seen brushing her hair. In another, she's sitting on the toilet, completely unaware she's being recorded. There were photos of Susan's feet, her legs, her behind. Close-ups, often zoomed in and grainy, all taken without her knowledge. Some of the most disturbing images were of her taken while she was sleeping. Among the videos and photographs, they also found dozens of pairs of women's underwear, many of which were later confirmed to belong to Susan. Stephen had stolen them from her laundry basket during visits and had labeled them by date. But the horror didn't end with Susan. As they continued searching Stephen's computer hard drives, investigators made another sickening discovery. Images of underage girls, including neighbors and classmates of Stephen's children, photographed in bathrooms, bedrooms, and changing areas. Some of the files met the legal criteria for child pornography. Susan Powell was arrested on multiple counts of voyeurism and possession of child pornography. He was denied bail and held in jail as investigators scrambled to sort through the overwhelming volume of evidence. The public was stunned, but no one more than Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. Up to that point, they had seen Josh as the primary suspect. But now, with the walls of the Powell family beginning to crack, a new fear emerged. Had Stephen played a role in Susan's disappearance? The Cox family confronted the horrifying possibility that Susan may have been trapped between two dangerous men, a controlling husband and a disturbed father-in-law. In interviews, Chuck described feeling physically ill after reading the journal entries. "I couldn't believe what I was reading. He was obsessed with my daughter. He thought she belonged to him." And yet, Stephen showed no remorse. In one of his early interviews from jail, he denied wrongdoing. "She knew I loved her," he said. "She led me on. She enjoyed the attention." Authorities began to question whether Josh had known about his father's behavior. Had he participated? Had he used Susan's disappearance to protect more than just himself? And perhaps most disturbingly, was it possible that Stephen knew what happened to her? Inside the Powell home, the dysfunction ran deep. Stephen had been known to make inappropriate comments to Susan for years. She once confided to friends that she felt uncomfortable around him, especially when he insisted on filming her or taking photos. In a chilling moment captured years earlier on a home video, Stephen asks Susan if he can videotape her for his journal. She looks visibly uneasy, but Josh, standing nearby, says nothing. Susan's friends recalled how Josh would often defend his father, even when Stephen's behavior crossed the line. "They were cut from the same cloth," one friend said. "Both of them treated Susan like she was their property." As Stephen awaited trial, Josh became increasingly isolated. The arrest of his father only heightened scrutiny on his own actions. He moved out of Stephen's house and into a rental home with the boys, but the walls were closing in. Law enforcement now had a clearer picture. This wasn't just a case of a missing wife. It was a story of obsession, control, and generational abuse. The Powell family wasn't just harboring secrets. It was drowning in them. Reporters descended on the courthouse during Stephen's hearings. The footage of him in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists, sent shockwaves across the country. He was ultimately convicted in 2012 and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. But for investigators, the conviction brought no closure. Stephen had refused to talk about Susan. He denied having any knowledge of what happened to her, and he continued to paint himself as a victim. Behind bars, he wrote more letters. He remained fixated on Susan. In one of his final statements to the press, he said, "She knew the power she had over me. The Powell family's web of dysfunction was finally exposed to the world." But the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Susan? What do you think Stephen Powell truly knew about Susan's fate? Could he have helped cover it up? Or was he simply another predator hiding in plain sight? The truth has a way of slipping out, even from the smallest voices. After Susan Powell's disappearance, her sons, 7-year-old Charlie and 5-year-old Braden, became the only living witnesses who might hold answers to what really happened that night. And over time, their innocent words would begin to haunt everyone who heard them. When Josh abruptly moved from Utah to Puyallup, Washington, he took the boys with him. On the surface, he told people he wanted a fresh start. A new job, a new home, a new life. But investigators saw something else. A man retreating from scrutiny, tightening control, and keeping his children close. At first, Josh resisted all contact between the boys and Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. It took legal pressure before the grandparents were granted visitation. And when they finally did see the boys, what they heard was chilling. During one visit, Charlie drew a picture of a car and a mine. When Judy gently asked what it was, he said, "That's where Mommy is, in the mine." On another occasion, he mentioned a camping trip, the same one Josh claimed to have taken the night Susan vanished. But Charlie's version was different. He said, "Mommy stayed in the trunk. She didn't come back with us." The Cox family reported the children's statements immediately to police and child psychologists. The boys were interviewed carefully using trauma-informed methods. Specialists noted signs of emotional distress, recurring nightmares, withdrawal, and confusion whenever their mother was mentioned. Charlie once told a teacher that his mom had gone on that trip with them but didn't come home. When asked where she went, he answered simply, "She was hurt." For investigators, every new detail was another piece of a puzzle that pointed directly back to Josh Powell. But despite the boys' remarks, there wasn't enough physical evidence to charge him. The frustration grew unbearable. Meanwhile, the Department of Child and Family Services, DCFS, in Washington began monitoring Josh's parenting. Caseworkers observed his interactions with the children and noticed troubling patterns: isolation, manipulation, and an unwillingness to talk about their mother. Josh often appeared calm and polite during visits, but behind that demeanor was a volatile man unraveling. Friends noticed how obsessed he had become with regaining full control of his sons. He kept detailed notes about custody hearings, wrote long letters defending his innocence, and blamed Susan's family for turning the boys against him. When Stephen Powell, Josh's father, was arrested on voyeurism and child pornography charges, Josh lost his strongest ally. The Cox family filed for custody, arguing that Josh was unfit to care for the boys in such an environment. The court agreed temporarily. Charlie and Braden were placed with their grandparents under state supervision. Josh was granted only supervised visitation, to be conducted at a DCFS facility with a social worker present at all times. It should have been a protective measure, but it wasn't enough. The boys continued to speak in fragmented memories, flashes of something they had seen but didn't understand. A campfire, a trunk, their mother's crying voice. One therapist described their drawings as expressions of trauma. Another noted that Charlie flinched at the mention of his father. Despite these warnings, Josh continued pushing for more time and fewer restrictions. In early 2012, he petitioned the court for unsupervised visitation, claiming he was a devoted father unfairly punished by rumors. His lawyer painted him as cooperative, attentive, and focused on his son's well-being. The Cox family begged the court not to allow it. Chuck Cox, in a later interview, recalled warning child services again and again. "We told them those boys weren't safe with Josh. We said it over and over. But no one listened. Even police shared quiet concerns." Behind the scenes, Utah detectives were still pursuing leads, including the possibility that Susan's body was hidden in an abandoned mine near Simpson Springs, the area Josh claimed to have gone camping. The location matched Charlie's haunting words. But despite repeated searches, the terrain was vast and dangerous, and nothing definitive was found. By January 2012, caseworkers recommended continuing supervised visits, a small relief for the Cox family. But Josh's behavior was growing more erratic. He was financially strained, living alone, and facing the possible permanent loss of custody. On February 5, 2012, a Sunday morning, a DCFS social worker brought Charlie and Braden to Josh's home for what was supposed to be a 1-hour supervised visit. It was routine, familiar, nothing unusual on the surface. As soon as they arrived, Josh greeted his sons at the door with an unusual urgency. He ushered them inside quickly, then locked the door behind them. The social worker, alarmed, knocked and shouted. There was no response. Moments later, the house exploded into flames. The fire spread so fast that neighbors could only watch in horror. The social worker called 911, her voice shaking, screaming, "He took them inside. He locked me out. The house is on fire." Firefighters arrived within minutes, but it was too late. The house was engulfed. Inside, they found the bodies of Josh Powell and his 2 sons. Investigators later confirmed what they feared. Josh had attacked his children with a hatchet before igniting the fire using gasoline. The explosion was intentional, a final act of control. Detectives pieced together what happened in those final moments. Josh had planned everything. He'd withdrawn his savings, donated his son's toys, and sent several emails just before the explosion, including one to his attorney that read, "I'm sorry. Goodbye." Another to his pastor said, "I can't live without my boys." The tragedy devastated everyone who had fought to protect the children. Investigators found a voicemail Josh left for his relatives minutes before the fire. "I'm sorry to everyone I've hurt. Goodbye." The autopsies confirmed what the fire had hidden. Both boys had injuries consistent with a hatchet attack before the flames consumed the house. The explosion had been meant to destroy everything: evidence, witnesses, and the last fragile ties to the truth about Susan Powell. The children had spoken the truth long before that day. They had told the world where their mother was, what they saw, and what they feared. No one truly listened until it was too late. Do you believe authorities could have prevented what happened to Charlie and Braden if they had acted sooner? If you believe Susan, Charlie, and Braden deserve justice, like this video, share it, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so their voices are never silenced again. It was a cold Sunday morning, February 5, 2012, when the final unthinkable chapter of the Powell family tragedy unfolded. The day began like so many others in Puyallup, Washington. A gray sky hung low over the quiet cul-de-sac where Josh Powell rented a modest home. On paper, it was supposed to be an ordinary supervised visit between a father and his 2 young sons. But what happened next would horrify the nation and expose how a system meant to protect children had failed in the most devastating way. That morning, a social worker from Washington's Department of Child and Family Services drove 5-year-old Braden and 7-year-old Charlie to Josh's home for their scheduled visit. The boys were happy, chatting in the back seat, excited to see their father. They didn't know this would be their last car ride. As soon as they arrived, Josh was already standing at the door. He smiled, called out to his sons, and as soon as they reached the porch, they ran toward him, laughing, unaware of the danger waiting behind that door. The social worker followed closely behind, carrying her clipboard, ready to supervise the visit like every other time. But before she could step inside, Josh slammed the door shut and locked it. She heard the click of the deadbolt. "Josh, open the door," she shouted. "You can't do that." There was no answer, just silence. Then, the faint sound of a child's voice and the unmistakable smell of gasoline. Panicked, the social worker ran back to her car and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she told the dispatcher what had happened. "He just locked me out. He took his kids inside. I think I smell gas." The dispatcher asked for the address, but precious seconds were already slipping away. On the call recording later released to the public, Her voice breaks as she pleads for help. "There's nothing I can do. I can't get in." Moments later, the house erupted in flames. The explosion was so powerful it rattled nearby windows and sent a column of black smoke twisting into the air. Neighbors came running from every direction, helplessly watching as the small, one-story home became an inferno. Inside were Josh Powell and his two sons, Charlie and Braden. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but the heat was too intense. The structure collapsed before anyone could reach them. By the time the flames were extinguished, there was nothing left but ash, twisted metal, and the unbearable stench of gasoline. When investigators sifted through the wreckage, they made a horrifying discovery. Near the remains of the front room, they found a 5-gallon gasoline can and evidence that accelerant had been poured throughout the house. Josh had clearly planned every step. The autopsy results later revealed even more disturbing details. Both boys had chop injuries to their heads and necks, consistent with being attacked with a hatchet before the fire was ignited. The burns were post-mortem, meaning they were already dead or dying when the flames consumed the house. In the garage, police found several empty gas containers and a melted hatchet head. On the kitchen counter lay a note from Josh, addressed to his family and friends. It read, "I'm sorry. Goodbye." Minutes before the explosion, he had also sent several emails, one to his attorney, another to his pastor, and one to his relatives, all conveying the same finality. "I can't live without my boys," one message said. Another warned, "This will be my last contact." Detectives later confirmed that Josh had withdrawn nearly all his money, donated his son's toys, and left his will on a table. He had planned this for weeks. The visit that morning wasn't spontaneous. It was an execution. When the news broke, the nation reacted with disbelief and outrage. Reporters flooded Puyallup. Vigils were held across Utah and Washington. Photos of Susan, Josh, Charlie, and Braden appeared side by side on television screens. The smiling family portrait that had once symbolized hope now stood as a chilling reminder of what had been lost. Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan's parents, were shattered. They had fought tirelessly to protect their grandsons, warning courts and caseworkers that Josh was dangerous. Their pleas had gone ignored. Just days before the fire, Chuck had told a judge, "Those boys are not safe." When he received the phone call that Sunday morning, Chuck collapsed. "They're all gone," he whispered. "Josh killed them." The 911 call from the social worker quickly became one of the most haunting recordings in modern true crime history. On it, she describes watching the house burn while waiting for emergency responders. She screams, "There's nothing I can do." The dispatcher, unaware of the urgency, asks routine questions, not realizing that the tragedy was already unfolding. By the time firefighters reached the scene, the roof had caved in. Investigators determined that Josh had attacked his sons with the hatchet moments after locking the door. Then he spread gasoline throughout the home and set it ablaze. It was a deliberate murder-suicide, carried out within minutes of the social worker's arrival. The explosion's timing was no accident. Josh had chosen the supervised visit to guarantee that his sons would be there, and that no one could stop him once they were inside. In the aftermath, the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services faced widespread criticism. How could Josh have been allowed visitation at his own home? Why hadn't the visits been held at a secure facility? Why weren't stronger safety protocols in place when the red flags were everywhere? The Cox family filed multiple lawsuits, arguing that the state had failed in its duty to protect the children. Eventually, they were awarded several $millions in damages, a symbolic recognition of a loss that no amount of money could ever repair. For law enforcement, the tragedy closed one door and opened another. With Josh gone, the only person who might have known the full truth about Susan Powell's disappearance was dead. Any hope of a confession died with him. Still, investigators pressed forward. They continued searching the Utah desert, digging through old mine shafts and remote ravines, hoping to find Susan's remains. But without Josh, the path to justice had turned to ashes, just like the house that burned on that February morning. In the end, Josh Powell didn't just destroy himself. He silenced his sons, the only two people who could have revealed what really happened to their mother. The fire that day wasn't just meant to kill. It was meant to erase. Do you think Josh planned the murder of his sons from the very beginning? Or did he decide it only after realizing the truth was closing in? When the flames of the Powell house finally went out in February 2012, investigators were left standing in the ashes, stunned, hollow, and furious. Josh Powell had ended his life and taken his two sons with him, but one question still burned. Who helped him? Because the evidence suggested that Susan's disappearance, the cleanup, and the years of manipulation afterward hadn't been the work of one man alone. Someone had helped Josh, someone who knew. Detectives soon began looking closer at Josh's younger brother, Michael Powell, a quiet, intelligent man living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He had a master's degree in computer science, rarely spoke to reporters, and appeared to live a normal, uneventful life. But behind that calm exterior, police suspected something darker. The first clue came from an unusual lead about a car. Shortly after Susan vanished in December 2009, Michael had purchased a 1997 Ford Taurus in Utah, just days after his brother became the primary suspect. Weeks later, he drove that car more than 800 miles north to Minnesota. Then, in a move investigators would later describe as highly suspicious, he sold the vehicle to a junkyard for only $100, having it destroyed before police could examine it. But detectives caught wind of the sale. The car was recovered before it could be crushed. A cadaver dog brought to the junkyard reacted strongly to the trunk area, signaling the possible scent of human decomposition. The find was explosive. For investigators, it suggested that Susan Powell's body, or something connected to it, might have been transported in that car. The reaction from the dog didn't prove that a body had been inside, but it was enough to reignite the investigation in a new direction. They sent the car to a forensic lab for testing. Swabs were taken from the trunk and floor mats, looking for traces of blood or DNA. But when the results came back, there wasn't enough material to draw a definitive conclusion. No identifiable human DNA was recovered. The evidence was powerful in implication, but weak in court. Even without charges, detectives remained convinced that Michael Powell had helped his brother dispose of Susan's body somewhere in the vast Utah desert, possibly near Simpson Springs, the area Josh had claimed to go camping the night she disappeared. Phone records later revealed a series of late-night calls between Josh and Michael in the days after Susan went missing. Investigators also learned that Michael had traveled back to Utah several times, despite telling friends he had no reason to be there. He rented cars, paid cash, and never explained his movements. Detectives theorized that Josh, after killing Susan in their West Valley City home, may have called Michael for help. Together, they could have transported her body to a remote mine shaft, one of thousands scattered across the desert west of Tooele County. But without a confession, every theory was just that, a theory. After the murder-suicide in Washington, police intensified their focus on Michael. He became the last living Powell who might still hold the truth. Search warrants were executed on his apartment in Minneapolis. Computers, hard drives, and cell phones were seized. What they found painted a portrait of a man unraveling. Forensic analysts discovered detailed maps of Utah's West Desert, internet searches about mine depths, and aerial imagery of Topaz Mountain, an area authorities had already searched for Susan's remains. There were also notes expressing paranoia and despair over the growing media attention and police pressure. Behind closed doors, Michael was struggling. He had defended Josh publicly after Susan's disappearance, calling the investigation a witch hunt. But after Josh's death, his tone changed. Friends described him as withdrawn, anxious, and increasingly unstable. He stopped returning calls. He quit his job. Detectives continued to press. They re-interviewed him several times, trying to fill the gaps that only he could answer. But Michael was cautious, polite but evasive. He denied knowing anything about Susan's fate, claimed the car meant nothing, and said he had moved on from the case. Then, in February 2013, almost exactly 1 year after Josh murdered his sons, tragedy struck again. On the morning of February 11th, firefighters were called to a high-rise apartment building near the University of Minnesota. Witnesses reported a man falling from the top level of a parking garage. It was Michael Powell. Police later ruled his death a suicide. He had jumped from the roof of the 7-story building, landing on the sidewalk below. A note found in his apartment expressed despair and hopelessness but offered no confession. No mention of Susan, no final explanation. For investigators, the shock was immediate and devastating. Another Powell was gone, and with him, possibly the last link to the truth. Detective Ellis Maxwell, who had led much of the Utah investigation, said later that Michael's death felt like the door slamming shut. Every route to finding Susan seemed to vanish one by one. First Josh, then his father Stephen, now Michael. Each had taken their secrets to the grave. Stephen Powell, still serving time for voyeurism and child pornography charges, refused to cooperate when told about his son's death. He showed no emotion, no sympathy. When pressed again about Susan, he simply said, "I have nothing to say." In the months following Michael's suicide, search teams once again combed through Utah's remote mine shafts and desert canyons. They used drones, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar, revisiting every location marked on the maps found in Michael's apartment. But Susan's body was never found. Her father, Chuck Cox, said it best in a quiet interview years later. They all took the truth with them, every one of them. 3 members of the Powell family gone. Each death closing another door, each silence burying the truth a little deeper. What began as the search for one missing woman had become the unraveling of an entire family built on lies, obsession, and control. And still, after years of searching, one question echoed through the desert. Where is Susan Powell? Do you believe Michael Powell helped Josh hide Susan's body? Or was he simply protecting a family secret too dark to face? If you're following this case and still believe Susan's story deserves answers, like this video, share it, subscribe and hit the bell so her memory and her truth can never be buried again. The desert keeps its secrets, and for more than a decade, the Utah desert has held on to Susan Powell's. After the February 2012 fire that killed Josh and their 2 little boys, investigators were left with only one goal: find Susan and bring her home. The West Valley City Police Department had followed every lead for 3 years, but without a body, the story felt unfinished. Now, with the entire Powell family fractured and the prime suspect dead, detectives turned their eyes once again toward the vast nothingness west of Salt Lake City, the place Josh always claimed to have camped the night she vanished. The area around Topaz Mountain, near Jueb County, is harsh and unforgiving. Wind scours the sand until it feels like shards of glass. In winter, the temperatures plunge below freezing. In summer, they can sear past 100 degrees. Dotting that landscape are thousands of old mine shafts, some dating back more than a century. They drop deep into the earth, some so narrow a grown man can barely fit, others wide enough to swallow a car. To detectives, they represented both opportunity and despair. Miles of terrain where a single body could remain hidden forever. Beginning in spring 2012, officers, geologists, and volunteer searchers combed the region. They lowered cameras into vertical shafts, rappelled into open pits, and used cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains through layers of rock and soil. When a dog alerted on a particular shaft near Topaz Mountain, hope flared. Searchers rigged ropes, lights, and breathing gear, descending one by one. At the bottom, they found animal bones, not human. The disappointment was crushing. Still, they kept going. Every few weeks, a new tip arrived. A rancher had noticed disturbed ground. A hiker had found a piece of clothing. A prospector had smelled decay in a collapsed tunnel. Crews checked each site. Nothing ever matched Susan. Volunteers came from across Utah, Idaho, and Washington. Entire weekends were spent walking grid patterns through the sagebrush. Some brought metal detectors and GPS trackers. Others simply brought prayers. The Cox family, Susan's parents, joined many of those searches. Chuck Cox often drove for hours into the desert, marking coordinates on a map spread across his dashboard. He once said he carried a satellite photo folded in his pocket. Every red mark a place already searched, every unmarked dot another promise he couldn't yet keep. At one point, investigators consulted mining historians to obtain sealed maps of abandoned shafts. Even with that data, the scale was staggering. More than 16,000 possible openings across Utah's West Desert Corridor. Many were unrecorded, flooded, or collapsed. Entering some of them would have meant certain death. Drones and ground-penetrating radar helped, but the technology of the time was limited. In 2013, as tips slowed and budgets thinned, the department began winding down its active field operations. Detectives re-interviewed Josh's acquaintances, revisited GPS logs, and traced vehicle records from the night of December 6th to 7th, 2009. None offered the breakthrough they needed. The only consistent pattern pointed back to Josh's suspicious trip to the desert and to his brother Michael's movements afterward. But both men were dead. That May, West Valley City Police held a somber press conference. After more than 800 leads, hundreds of interviews, and countless searches, they announced that the active investigation was being closed. The evidence, they said, proved beyond reasonable doubt that Josh Powell murdered his wife. But without a body, without witnesses left alive, prosecutors could never take the case to trial. Detective Ellis Maxwell spoke quietly to reporters. "We believe Susan was killed at her home, her body taken to a remote location in the West Desert, and disposed of in a way that will make recovery very difficult." For Susan's parents, that statement felt like both confirmation and heartbreak. Chuck Cox told the press, "We always knew he did it. We just wanted to bring her home." Judy Cox added that she still set a place for her daughter at family gatherings, because you can't close a wound you can't see. Even after the case went inactive, the searching didn't stop. Private citizens, amateur sleuths, and organized nonprofits kept exploring minefields near Simpson Springs and Topaz Mountain. In 2015, a group of volunteers using new imaging technology scanned dozens of sealed shafts. In 2018, another team explored a series of caves near the Dugway Proving Ground. Each time, hope rose. Each time, hope broke. To this day, the desert still calls out to people who followed Susan's story. Some leave flowers at trailheads. Others tie blue ribbons to signposts along the dirt roads leading toward Topaz Mountain. The Cox family continues to run the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, promoting domestic violence awareness and supporting children affected by family homicide. Their activism turned unimaginable loss into purpose. Law enforcement periodically reopens small pieces of the case when credible information surfaces. In 2019, police confirmed that tips still trickle in every year, some pointing to new mines, others to possible secondary burial sites. None have yet produced answers. In 2021, the Utah Cold Case Coalition included Susan's name among the state's top unresolved cases and offered resources for renewed ground searches. More than a decade has passed, but for those who loved her, time hasn't dulled the urgency. They still speak of her in the present tense, as a daughter, a sister, a mother whose smile filled every photograph. What remains missing is not only her body, but the chance to give her a resting place. Voice lowers, steady but aching. The investigation may have been closed, but the desert has never stopped whispering her name. Somewhere in those endless canyons, among the rusted mine shafts and red stone ridges, lies the truth of what Josh Powell tried so hard to erase. Do you believe one day someone hiking those deserts will finally stumble upon Susan Powell's remains? Or has the truth already been lost to time? They warned them. Again and again they warned them. But no one listened, at least not fast enough to save Charlie and Braden. After the fire, after the screams stopped, after the smoke cleared from the rubble that had once been Josh Powell's rental home, people wanted to know how it had come to this. How a man under investigation for his wife's disappearance, living under a cloud of suspicion, tethered to a family drenched in dysfunction, was allowed to be alone, even for a moment, with two small boys. It was a question that wouldn't go away, because the answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just a single missed signal or one official turning a blind eye. The truth was more brutal. The system itself failed. Piece by piece, it cracked under the weight of procedure, hesitation, and bureaucracy. And in that space, a killer made his move. When Josh was granted supervised visitation, it came with conditions. The meetings were to take place in the presence of a social worker, but they were allowed to happen at his home, the same home he had rigged with gasoline and fire starters. The same home where he locked the door and kept that social worker on the other side, powerless, as he took an axe to his sons and then lit the match. Long before that final moment, there were warnings. The Cox family had told the courts they feared for the boys. Friends of Susan had said it too. Child psychologists reported troubling statements from Charlie and Braden. Descriptions of their mother in the trunk or in the mine. It wasn't normal, and it wasn't vague. There were also formal concerns raised by state workers. Case managers worried about Josh's behavior. He was evasive, manipulative, and non-compliant with aspects of his court-ordered psychological evaluation. That alone should have paused everything. But it didn't. The wheels of the system kept turning, even as the alarms got louder. In the months after the boys were killed, a formal child fatality review was launched by Washington State. The findings were sobering. The review committee concluded that several key agencies had failed to communicate effectively. Critical information about Josh Powell's criminal investigation wasn't properly factored into visitation decisions. There was no system in place that required law enforcement to be consulted before approving where or how visits would take place. And so, in the absence of that mandate, the red flags were treated as background noise. One report noted that the court had been operating on incomplete information. While the Department of Social and Health Services knew Josh was under suspicion for Susan's disappearance, the judge had not been presented with the full scope of the concern. Josh had refused to undergo certain evaluations, and his father, Susan Powell, had already been convicted of voyeurism and child pornography. That alone should have triggered a complete reassessment of Josh's parental access. But instead, visitation continued. When the review board issued its report, it didn't mince words. It pointed out that agencies had missed opportunities to reevaluate visitation in light of mounting risk. They criticized the lack of mandatory coordination between DSHS and law enforcement, and they strongly recommended legislative reform to prevent another tragedy from slipping through the cracks. But for Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan's parents, those findings weren't enough. They didn't want another report. They wanted accountability. In 2013, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state of Washington. They argued that the government, through its agencies and decisions, had failed in its duty to protect their grandsons. That Josh should never have had the chance. That warning after warning had been ignored. The legal battle was long, draining, and public. At the heart of it was a simple question. When do systems become complicit in the harm they failed to stop? In 2020, a Pierce County jury answered. They awarded the Cox family nearly $100 million in damages, finding that Washington State was negligent in its handling of the case. The verdict was seen as a landmark moment, not just for the family, but for victims of systemic failure everywhere. But the state pushed back. The judge later reduced the award significantly, saying the jury may have acted from emotion. The Cox family appealed, and in 2023, the appellate court sided with them. The full verdict was reinstated, nearly $98.5 million. Not because it could bring back the boys, not because it could undo what had been done, but because it sent a message. That silence has a cost. That indifference, when it comes to the safety of children, is not just a policy failure, it's a betrayal. Still, Chuck and Judy Cox didn't stop there. They pushed for change. They began advocating for laws that would require mandatory coordination between child welfare agencies and police departments. They called for stricter rules around supervised visitation, especially when one parent is under active investigation. And they used their platform to fight for children they'd never met. Kids trapped in dangerous homes, waiting for a system to wake up before it's too late. They spoke to lawmakers. They testified. They built the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, dedicated to reforming the very policies that had failed their family. And in every interview, in every speech, they reminded the world. This wasn't just about Susan. It wasn't just about Charlie and Braden. It was about every child overlooked by the systems built to protect them. The courts gave Josh access. The agencies didn't coordinate. The warning signs were there, but nothing changed until it was too late, and 3 lives were lost, not just because of one man's cruelty, but because of a system that let him carry it out unchecked. Do you believe our current child protection system is equipped to prevent tragedies like this? What one reform do you think could have made the difference? If you believe children deserve more than apologies after the fact, like this video, share it, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let's hold the system accountable. And never forget the names Susan, Charlie, and Braden Powell. Long before the headlines, before the search warrants and custody battles, before the courtroom tears and the fire that ended everything, she was just Susan. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother. Her name was Susan Cox Powell, and she mattered. Born on October 16, 1981, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, Susan grew up in Puyallup, Washington, the second of 4 children in a close-knit, church-going family. Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, raised her with strong values, faith, and a belief in kindness. From a young age, Susan was described as thoughtful, creative, and fiercely loyal. She played the cello in middle school, loved horseback riding, and had a warm, natural smile that made people feel safe. She met Josh Powell in the early 2000s through their church. He was charming, articulate, and ambitious. At first, he seemed like a good match, dedicated to his faith, eager to build a future. They married in 2001. Susan was just 19, and she was in love. She believed they could grow together, build a life centered around their shared beliefs. That love was real, and in those early years, it showed. When they moved to Utah, Susan took on the role of provider. She worked as a stockbroker with Wells Fargo Investments, earning a reputation as a responsible, driven, and compassionate team member. She often baked treats for coworkers, decorated her desk with pictures of her sons, and brought warmth into even the most mundane workdays. She was proud of her job, but her greatest joy lived at home. Her sons, Charlie and Braden, they were everything to her. Every photo captures it. Her arms wrapped around them, a smile that's all eyes and soul. Susan threw themed birthday parties, made homemade decorations, and kept journals filled with letters to her boys. She wanted them to grow up safe, strong, and loved. She wrote about their milestones, their favorite foods, their bedtime routines. Even as her marriage began to unravel, she never let her love for them falter. But behind the public face, the cracks had begun to form. Josh became increasingly controlling. He monitored every dollar she spent. He demanded she account for where she went, who she talked to, what she said. He isolated her, took control of the family's finances, refused to get a steady job. At one point, he even filed for bankruptcy, leaving Susan to hold the financial weight of the household alone. Worse, Susan felt uncomfortable around Josh's father, Stephen Powell. She confided in friends that Stephen had developed an unhealthy fixation on her, watching her through bathroom doors, stealing her belongings, even recording her without her consent. She once caught him hiding behind a door with a camera. She told friends she didn't feel safe around him. Susan began documenting everything. Her journals, later recovered, painted the portrait of a woman trying to survive. She wrote, "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one." She created a video inventory of the home for insurance purposes and told coworkers she was preparing to leave the marriage. She was planning a future beyond Josh, one where she could raise her sons safely, freely, and without fear. On December 6, 2009, Susan made pancakes with her boys. She wasn't feeling well and took a nap that afternoon. Later that evening, neighbors recall her sounding tired but cheerful when they briefly visited. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The next day, she didn't show up for work. Josh told police he had taken the boys camping in the middle of the night, in a frozen Utah desert with no gear, in sub-zero temperatures. It didn't make sense. But there was no body, no physical evidence. Josh refused to take a polygraph, refused to cooperate, refused to help. And then, 2 years later, with the walls closing in, Josh murdered Charlie and Braden. He locked the door, struck them with a hatchet, and set the house on fire. His final act wasn't just destruction, it was erasure. He silenced the only 2 voices left who might have told the truth. But Susan's memory didn't die with them. Couldn't. In the wake of the tragedy, her parents created the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, dedicated to helping families facing domestic abuse and fighting for policy reform. They pushed for stricter oversight of child visitation, greater transparency between law enforcement and social services, and broader awareness about the hidden warning signs of coercive control. Through their efforts, Susan's name became a banner, not of tragedy, but of change. Friends described her as someone who made you feel seen. She had a laugh that danced and a heart that listened. She brought people together, remembered birthdays, volunteered to help without needing credit. One coworker said, "She never talked about her pain, but you could tell in the quiet moments that she was carrying more than most. And yet she stayed kind, stayed present, stayed strong for her sons." Her journals, discovered after she vanished, are heartbreaking in their clarity. She knew, she feared this, but she fought anyway, not with fists or fury, but with strategy, with quiet resilience, with love. And now, all these years later, her body has still never been found. Volunteers have searched the Utah desert, focused on mine shafts near Topaz Mountain. Cadaver dogs once hit on areas of interest, but no remains were recovered. Her father still studies maps, still marks coordinates, still holds out hope for closure, because she deserves to be found, to be brought home, to have a headstone bearing her name, a place for flowers, for tears, for peace. Instead, she lingers in photographs, in foundation fundraisers, in news reports, in this story. Still missing, still loved. Her name is Susan. Say it again. In loving memory, Susan Cox Powell. Born October 16th, 1981. Missing since December 6th, 2009. A devoted mother, daughter, and friend. Her love was fierce. Her voice still echoes. Her story is not over. Charles Charlie Powell. Born January 19th, 2005. Died February 5th, 2012. Age 7. Curious, kind, and protective. He loved art, his brother, and building things with his mom. Braden Timothy Powell. Born January 2nd, 2007. Died February 5th, 2012. Age 5. Gentle, sweet, and full of joy. He loved to draw, tell stories, and snuggle with his mom. This tribute is dedicated to all victims of domestic violence and child homicide. May their memories inspire change, courage, and protection for the vulnerable. What do you believe really happened to Susan? And what should have been done differently to protect her and her sons? Her story didn't end with that explosion. Share her name, say it out loud, and never stop asking the hard questions. Like, share, subscribe for more true crime stories that deserve to be told, and hit the notification bell.